Chapter 12, Off the Rails. Reinforcements arrive. Misato's apartment. Shinji? Asuka repeated, her face devoid of any color. Who are you? The boy didn't reply, he remained completely quiet. Misato pressed her fingers against his neck, looking for a pulse. There was one, but it was very faint. We have to take him to the hospital, she said, panic rising in her voice. She fumbled about for her cell phone with one hand and pressed a cloth to Shinji's wound with the other in an attempt to staunch the bleeding. With a sick feeling in her stomach, she realized that her phone's screen was smeared in blood. And what? Tell the doctor, hey, could you be kind and operate on Zone Fighter while keeping quiet about it? Kensuke asked incredulously. Nerve will come in and dissect him or something. We can't let them do that to him. We can't just let him die. Misato snapped back. There was the sound of footsteps behind them, and Kensuke turned his head, half expecting to find Section 2 agents moving in with raised guns. Instead he found the robot that had saved him the other day standing in the hallway. Standing next to it was Mrs. Segusa? Kensuke blinked to make sure he wasn't dreaming. No, his substitute teacher was actually standing right next to a robot in the hallway. The two entered the apartment and knelt alongside Misato, gently pushing her to the side. The robot produced a syringe out of nowhere and injected its contents into Shinji's arm. The boy's breathing became a bit more even, but otherwise remained unaffected. Misato simply stared in shock. The events of the day were finally too much for her. Mrs. Segusa shook her head. He's lost a lot of blood. I don't think he'll make it to the island. We believe that we can be of help, two voices said simultaneously to their side. Kensuke turned to the source of the voices and had another great shock of the day. Standing on Shinji's pillow were two women, identical in appearance and garbed in clothing more at home in the pre-impact Pacific Islands. Of course, the most shocking part was the fact that they were only 6 inches tall. At this point, Kensuke was beginning to seriously doubt his sanity. Who are you? Kensuke asked, his jaw dropping. We are the twin priestesses of Mothra. We are also known as the Shobaijin, the Elias, and the Cosmos, the twins said in that rather unsettling unison. We speak for the goddess and her fellow rulers of Earth, one said. We are also a conduit for a fraction of her power, the other said. You can help Shinji? Misato managed to finally say, having digested most of what she had seen in the past 10 minutes. The Shobaijin nodded. Please move away from Shinji Ikari, they said. Misato and the others complied. Once they did so, the twins turned to Shinji, raised their arms, and began to sing. Mahal Mahal Mashra. Tama Tama Mashra. Laban Guerrillabenen. Misato saw that Shinji was beginning to glow now, a gentle orange aura that illuminated the entire apartment. Pen took notice as well, and exited his freezer to watch, concern lining his avian face. Laban Guerrillabenen. Mahal Mahal Mashra. Tama Tama Mashra. The song finished, and the glow faded with it. With a gasp, Misato realized that Shinji's wounds were completely gone. His breathing was even and devoid of any gurgles or rasps. How did why? We channeled a portion of the goddess's power to heal him of his wounds, the twins replied. He must rest now, one said. We must hurry, the other said. Forces against all of us are converging on our location. With that, the twins vanished. There was no bright light, no flourish of smoke or energy to indicate their departure. One moment they were there, the next they weren't. They're right, Mrs. Segusa said. We have a car ready, pack the essentials quickly and then let's go. The robot gently took Shinji into its arms and began to carry him out of the door. Misato grabbed Pen and hurried after them. Kensuke, having nothing with him and really wishing now that he had a camera with him, was next. Asuka paused briefly in thought, then went into Shinji's room. She returned quickly and ran after the others, unstat player in her hand. There was indeed a car waiting for them, most likely a rental. The robot was nowhere to be seen, probably secreted away in the trunk in order to reduce suspicion. Mrs. Segusa took the driver's seat, Misato took the passenger seat. Shinji was asleep in the middle seat in the back row, and Asuka and Kensuke sat on either side of him. Strangely enough, the redhead pilot didn't seem to mind when his head leaned against her shoulder. The car ride was spent in silence, mainly because one occupant was asleep, one wasn't fond of verbal communication, and the others were still trying to sort out what was happening. Eventually they arrived in the ruins of Old Tokyo, a silent memorial to the brutal impact wars. They passed through a veritable forest of crumbling buildings until they came to a clearing in the dead city, where Misato, Kensuke, and Asuka received yet another shock as they exited the car. One would figure that they would realize the sheer insanity of their situation and be prepared for anything that came next, but they didn't. There was, for a lack of better terms, a giant moth resting in the clearing. Its wings were easily 100 meters across, and brightly colored. Sapphire blue compound eyes regarded the group, and the great moth chirped softly. This must have been the Mothra that the Shobaijin were speaking of. Speaking of the Shobaijin, they were waiting for the group, perched on a large piece of rubble in front of Mothra. "You have arrived," they said in unison. "It is timely, any sooner and you may have been lost," one said. "Come now, we shall head to the island," the other said. Before any of the three could ask what they meant by that, they suddenly found themselves surrounded by an orange aura. Kensuke had to suppress a yelp as they were lifted into the air, and Pen began to wildly flail about in Misato's arms. They floated over Mothra, deposited onto the great moth's back. Its fur was soft and warm, and the feel of it relaxed Kensuke somewhat. Mrs. Segusa and the robot were sitting up on Mothra's head, the Shobaijin in between them. Chirping once more, Mothra flew into the sky with a flap of her tremendous wings, quickly leaving Old Tokyo behind. There was no sense of motion as they flew, other than a soft breeze. They were over the ocean now, and the moon's light reflected across the waves. It was a beautiful experience, something that no one would forget. Finally gaining a semblance of courage, he let go of the fur and laid back, relaxed. After some time they reached an island, its dark silhouette standing out amongst the silver-capped waves. Mothra swooped down low to the ground, and with a final chirp and flap of her wings, landed. An orange glow surrounded the group once more, and they were deposited onto the barren sands of the island. There were people waiting for them, standing close to some military vehicle Kensuke and Misato had never seen before, which was really saying something. One was a tall Caucasian man in a trench coat of sorts, a katana slung along his back. The other two appeared to be Japanese, a man and a woman. Both were garbed in some type of uniform, although the man had armor covering his. To Misato's surprise, the fourth and final person there was Kaji, still dressed in his loose-fitting clothes. "Glad you could make it," Kaji said, grinning as usual. "I still don't know what's going on," Misato said. She sat down on the sand and ran a hand through her hair. "I could really use a beer right now." "That alcoholic beverage will have to wait," the robot said. "We have much to discuss." "Jet's right, Mrs. Segusa. This concerns all of you." "Does that mean we're finally going to get answers?" Misato demanded. The robot, apparently called Jet, nodded. "Take a seat, all of you," it said, gesturing to some chairs that had been fetched from the vehicle. Misato and the others did as told. Pen worked in discontent and hopped into Misato's lap. It was the older Japanese woman who spoke first. "Are any of you familiar with the multiverse theory?" Whoa, Kensuke said, wildly gesticulating. "Are you telling me you're from some alternate universe or something?" The woman paused. "Yes," she said bluntly. "Do you really expect us to believe that?" Misato asked, incredulous. "You're under assault by giant alien monsters capable of producing fields that violates the core laws of physics," And you're having trouble believing we're from another universe? The Japanese man said, equally incredulous. Fair enough, Misato grumbled. It was the Caucasian man's turn to speak. Our universes are very different. In recent terms, the main point of divergence appears to be in 1954. What happened in 1954? Kensuke asked. A nuclear detonation on Lagos Island woke something up, the Caucasian man replied, setting a device of sorts on the ground. A holographic image formed above it, showing a massive creature rampaging through a city. It looked rather familiar. Is that Godzilla? Misato asked. A specimen from a different species, the Japanese woman interjected. It's kind of like the difference between an Allosaurus and a T-Rex. This creature, which we called Godzilla, was mutated and grievously burned by the test, the Caucasian man continued. It lashed out like an injured animal, impervious to the weapons of the time. It ended up destroying Tokyo and killed 120,000 people. How did you stop it? Asked Misato. A scientist named Daisuke Serizawa, who was researching oxygen in hopes of improving ocean fertility for fishing, ended up accidentally creating a terrible weapon, the Japanese replied. We call it the oxygen destroyer. Serizawa was horrified by his own creation, but realized what needed to be done, the Caucasian man said. The day after Godzilla's attack, he went to Tokyo Bay with the oxygen destroyer and dived to the bottom, right where the creature was resting. The weapon succeeded in killing it, but Serizawa stayed down in order to prevent any more from being built. What happened after that? Misato asked. The bomb's fallout woke up something else, the Caucasian man replied. The hologram shifted, showing a familiar set of spines slicing through the waves off the shore of some tropical island. Him. Godzilla, Kensuke said. The man nodded. 3 times larger and far more powerful than Godzilla. Naturally, the governments of the world panicked. You know those nuclear tests in the Pacific, at Bikini Atoll? Kensuke nodded. I memorized the yields of each bomb, he said. The man raised an eyebrow before continuing. They weren't tests. They were trying to kill him. Are you telling me that he's shrugged off a 15-megaton detonation? Kensuke asked, practically salivating now. The man nodded. I was personally involved at the time. Hold on, Misato interjected. That was in 1954, 61 years ago. You should be in adult diapers or dead. That brings us to the next topic of discussion, Mrs. Segusa replied. In 1957, Earth was invaded. By aliens? Kensuke exclaimed. Mrs. Segusa nodded. They were called the Mysterians, a species nearly destroyed by their own weapons. They attacked Earth in desperation, hoping to gain territory and women to breed with. Armed with weapons far more advanced than our own, it appeared that victory would be total for them. How did you win? Misato asked. They came to our aid, Mrs. Segusa replied. The hologram showed old-time war footage more at home in a World War II documentary than an alien invasion. Tanks, jeeps, artillery, and soldiers were advancing on some dome in the mountains of Japan. The dome suddenly opened fire with a beam of sorts, cutting swaths through the forces on the ground. Squadrons of jet fighters fared no better. When all seemed lost, Godzilla suddenly appeared, accompanied by some spiky ankylosaur thing. Mothra flew overhead, a large pterosaur of sorts following shortly behind. The following battle was a massacre. The dome's beam had no effect on any of them, only serving to make them angrier. A couple of large war machines emerged from the ground, but were promptly destroyed. The ankylosaur reached the dome first, slamming its massive bulk into it. Godzilla also attacked, throwing a ruined war machine at it and following up with his atomic breath. The footage ends from there, Mrs. Segusa said, the hologram shutting off. The Mysterians surrendered after their military forces were crippled by Godzilla and the others. They began to intermingle with us, marrying humans and revolutionizing the tech industry. Products of that revolution include jet over there and anti-aging drugs. In a way, they got what they were fighting for, a new home and a sustainable gene pool. They could interbreed with us? Kensuke asked. Mrs. Segusa nodded. I'm actually half Mysterian. My human name is Miki Segusa. My Mysterian name is Ikebrid Tranesu. Holy shit, Misato said. Anyway, Miki continued, Godzilla and the others proved themselves to be allies, not enemies. The Shobijin have poetically waxed them to be the rulers of Earth, protectors of the world and its people. Earth has flourished like never before, although there are plenty of threats out there. We've actually been invaded several times since the Mysterians, and giant monsters are constantly being woken up or created by accidents. We created a facility on a remote island to study and contain the monsters. This island, actually. Of course, it's in the other universe. So, how did you get here? Misato asked. The other woman spoke again. We were performing an experiment with wormholes called Dimension Tide, she said. There was an accident, and Godzilla was sucked into the wormhole and deposited here, alongside several samples of Kaiju tissue and the zone capsule. Asuka's eyes narrowed. Zone capsule? She said, finally breaking her long silence. The woman nodded. During one of the alien invasions in the 70s, an energy being of immense power bonded with a human and helped fight the aliens off. When the war was over, it placed itself into a capsule for storage. And then it wound up in this universe, saw how bad the situation was, and decided to bond with a human, the Caucasian man said. Shinji, Asuka stated, glancing back at the boy's sleeping form. It bonded with Shinji. The man nodded. He actually knew about us, but kept quiet when we told him what was at stake. What do you mean by that? Misato asked. It was Kaji's turn to speak now. Third impact, he said. So? That's what we've been doing, fighting the angels to prevent third impact, Misato replied. Kaji shook his head. Not the angels' plans for third impact. I'm talking about Seal's plan. Seal? Misato asked. Who's that? The rat bastards behind second impact, Kaji replied. The commander's in league with them, too. They've got roots everywhere, from Nerve to the UN itself. They're trying to start third impact and become gods. Misato was at a loss for words. Her memories raced back to that day in Antarctica. She clenched her cross hard enough to draw blood. Are you telling me, she finally managed to say through gritted teeth, that my father and 3 billion other people were killed by a bunch of assholes? Kaji nodded. That's why we're going to make them pay. How? Kensuke blurted out, shocked by what he just learned. What can we do against a group that caused second impact? You'll have our help, the Caucasian man said. Commander Gordon, at your service. Shinichi Ozaki, the Japanese man said, at your service. Miyuki Otonashi, at your service, the Japanese woman said. Jet Jaguar, at your service, the robot said. Miki Segusa, at your service. Kaji chuckled. There's more where that came from. Where do you think I've been? I was helping them get reinforcements. It was then that Misato and the others realized that the mountains in the distance weren't actually mountains. 3 massive shapes moved through the shadows, looming over them. They recognized the center shape first. The fiery orange eyes were hard to forget. To its left was the spiky ankylosaur, and to its right was the huge pterosaur that had fought against the Mysterians. Ladies and gentlemen, Kaji said in a grandiose manner more at home in the circus than some deserted island, may I formally introduce to you Godzilla, Rodan, Anguirus, and Mothra, the rulers of Earth. Almost as if on cue, Godzilla roared. It was a challenge, they realized, to Seal and anyone else who dared to harm the Earth under his watch. Many miles away, Gendo Ikari sneezed.